One of the things I suggest in the book is that time expansion experiences are all about transcending separateness. As soon as we step outside the normal, solid boundaries of the ego, we find ourselves in this expansive realm, or even this place where time does not exist. And that's why in all time expansion or time cessation experiences, everybody has a feeling of connection. They feel connected to other people. They feel connected to their surroundings. They even feel that they are one with their surroundings or one with the whole cosmos, which is, we're talking about spiritual or mystical experiences here. So at the same time as transcending separateness, we also transcend time, because linear time, certainly the kind of fast-flowing linear time, which is our normal experience, is created by the ego, or most specifically created by the boundaries of the ego.
Okay, Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi, Niall. Great to be with you.
You've just published a fascinating book on time expansion experiences, the psychology of time perception and the illusion of linear time. What would you say the central thesis of your book is?
The central thesis is, I guess, that time is flexible and subjective, and it varies according to our state of consciousness. And when we get into altered states of consciousness, particularly in dramatic or intense altered states, time usually slows down drastically. It expands very, very dramatically. And ultimately, that leads to my thesis that time doesn't really exist. It's not a fundamental reality of the universe.
Okay. That's a great jumping off point. To what extent can we control our experience of time, Steve?
Definitely to some extent. I mean, we do this on a kind of day-to-day basis anyway, without thinking about it. We know that we can contract time by putting ourselves into a state of absorption. We do this in waiting situations every day. We pick up a magazine or we look at our phones to try to make time slip away, so that we don't have to wait as long. And we also know that, at least unconsciously, we know that new experiences stretch time. Many people have had the experience of traveling to a foreign country for a few days, having lots of new experiences, lots of exciting encounters. And then they come back home and they feel like they've been away for much longer than 5 days. It feels more like 5 weeks than 5 days. So these are the kind of everyday variations in time experience, which we're all familiar with. But I think we can control our experience of time in a more fundamental, a more dramatic way through time expansion. The central idea of my book is that the central focus of my book is that there are certain situations and certain states of consciousness when time expands very radically, so that a few seconds can seem more like a minute or even longer. And if you look into the psychological aspects of those experiences, what actually happens on a psychological level in these states of consciousness, then we can, consciously create those conditions, or we can consciously create those states of consciousness, at least to some degree.
For sure, for sure. What came to mind for me there was, so when I was in my teens, I worked a summer job in a sawmill, and it was the most mind-numbing work ever. You were literally just like lifting pieces of wood from one place to another all day, every day. But the golden rule I learned is like never look at the clock, because the more you look at the clock, the slower time goes. There is definitely things we can do to alter our perception of time. Now, the thing I wanted to ask you is like, why is this important? And maybe here you could tell us about the car crash experience you had and how this led to the book as well.
Yeah, this was the origin of the book. I mean, I actually did write a book about time back in 2007. It was called Making Time. And in that book, I tried to explore why time seems to go quickly in states of absorption, why it seems to go quickly as we get older, why it seems to speed up as we get older, and so on. But after I wrote that book, I thought, I've kind of dealt with the subject of time now. I can move on to other areas. But 10 years ago, I had my wife and I were driving along the M60 motorway just outside Manchester. And we were in the middle. I was driving in the middle lane, and a truck was on the inside lane, but he didn't see us. He tried to pull out into the middle lane and clip the back of our car, which began to spin round. He hit us. He hit us twice actually. Um, but as soon as I heard the noise, as soon as I heard the crunching noise, I remember saying to my wife, "What was that noise?" And then there was a very long pause before the car started to spin round. It seemed to be spinning round very slowly. And I looked behind me, and the cars, yeah, it was a busy motorway, so there were long lines of cars behind us, but they all seemed to be frozen, or at least in very slow motion. My perceptions became very detailed too, very heightened. So I remember seeing the frightened faces of the drivers behind us, like, "Oh no, there's going to be an accident. Someone's going to be seriously injured." And I was aware of the danger too. I remember thinking very rationally, "This is very dangerous." So spinning around in the middle of the motorway, this is extremely dangerous. We're probably going to be seriously injured. But I wasn't frightened at all. I was extremely calm and very, very rational. So I started thinking very methodically, what can I do? Is there anything I can do to try to get out of this dangerous situation? I tried, jolting the steering wheel to the left towards the hard shoulder. I tried the handbrake. And, maybe because of what I did, the car veered towards the hard shoulder and crashed into the barrier. And as soon as that happened, everything went back into normal time and normal consciousness. I remember looking at my wife and I thought, wow, she's not been hurt. We're going to be okay. And I looked at my own body and thought, wow, I've not been hurt. So the car was so badly damaged it had to be scrapped, but we were uninjured. But the whole incident probably didn't last longer than 3 or 4 seconds in real time. But in my mind, it was more like 40. I would estimate like 45 seconds. I had so much time to think, to perceive the situation, to try to take some preventative action. So that really got me thinking about time again. And it really made me aware that time is totally subjective, it's totally flexible. So I began to, research as a psychologist. I began to research time expansion experiences. I began to collect reports of them from other people. And once I'd collected about 100, I began to analyze them to work out the different situations in which they occur and the different characteristics of time expansion experiences.
Incredible. And so this sort of points to the idea that in our ordinary state of consciousness, we've only got access to a very limited range of the actual full spectrum of what's available time-wise. And then whenever we enter these altered states, we're outside of our sort of normal egoic mode. And then we can sort of, I suppose, access more of that spectrum. Is that kind of what we're saying here?
To some extent, yeah. I mean, I've always loved the quote from the psychologist and philosopher William James, where he says that we tend to take our normal consciousness for granted, but in reality, it's just one thin slither of consciousness surrounded by other potential states of consciousness. And when he experimented with psychedelics, and he said that when you ingest psychedelics, you slip outside this fragmentary consciousness and explore different ranges of consciousness. And time expansion experiences, they point towards the same truth that what we take our normal consciousness for granted, and we take our normal experience of time for granted. But as soon as you have a time expansion experience, or even a time cessation experience, which is when time doesn't just slow down, it seems to stop altogether, then you realize that time is just a subjective phenomenon. Consciousness itself is flexible and subjective, and there are different realities or different experiences which uncover themselves as soon as we step outside our normal consciousness.
For sure, for sure. So I'm going to read out a couple of quotes here, and I'd just like to get your thoughts on them. So the first is from uh, Meister Eckhart. His is, "Time is what keeps the light from reaching us. There is no greater obstacle to God than time." And the second is from Carl Jung, and it's, "Hurry is not of the devil, hurry is the devil." So you're a psychologist, but you've written a lot about spirituality over the years. What are your thoughts on the link between time and spirituality?
Well, Meister Eckhart, he wrote a lot about time, and there are many passages where he speaks about the eternal moment, and how both time and individuality separate us from God. And he said that at the essence of the soul, or at the very ground of the soul, there is no time. He said, there's a passage I quote in my book where he says, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he says that to the soul, 1,000 years in the past and 1,000 years in the future are both in the now. Because for the soul, there are no tomorrows or yesterdays. There is only this eternal present. And he said that to God, it's the same to God. For God, there is no time. There is just an eternity of presence. So yeah, I completely agree with that. And, linear time is part of the ego. It's a kind of, it's a manifestation of the ego, you could say. I think it actually stems from a sense of separateness. One of the things I suggest in the book is that time expansion experiences are all about transcending separateness. As soon as we step outside the normal solid boundaries of the ego, we find ourselves in this expansive realm, or even this place where time does not exist. And that's why in all time expansion or time cessation experiences, everybody has a feeling of connection. They feel connected to other people. They feel connected to their surroundings. They even feel that they are one with their surroundings or one with the whole cosmos, which is, we're talking about spiritual or mystical experiences here. So at the same time as transcending separateness, we also transcend time, because linear time, certainly the kind of fast-flowing linear time, which is our normal experience, is created by the ego, or most specifically created by the boundaries of the ego.
Mm. We've mentioned the word probably 1,000 times in this conversation already, but it's probably important to define our terms here. You've probably thought about this more than anybody, but what is time, Steve? What do we mean by the word time?
I would suggest there are two different aspects of time. There is the human man-made time, or human-made time, which consists of measurements like seconds and minutes and hours. It's a question of dividing our days into segments of time in which we can then fill with activity. But maybe more fundamentally, time is about duration. The world consists of processes. Our life is a process. We're born, we grow, we eventually start to dissolve away and disappear. It's all a process. The year is a process of the earth rotating around the sun. The day is a process of the earth rotating on its axes. So everything is a process. The seasons are a process. So time is simply duration, the duration of a particular process. But the essential, one essential aspect is that duration is experienced in different ways. Different animals experience a season in a different way to human beings. For most animals, it probably lasts a lot longer than it does for human beings, because most animals have faster metabolisms and experience a slower speed of time. But even to human beings, how we experience duration depends on our state of consciousness and the situation that we're in.
For sure, for sure. Now the subtitle of your book mentions that linear time is an illusion. From your research, what do you feel is the most compelling evidence that this is the case?
As I said earlier, I speak about time cessation experiences. And I didn't set out to explore those experiences. It was just that when I was collecting time expansion experiences, some people wrote to me to say, well, time didn't just slow down, it just disappeared altogether. There was no time. I was in this place where time just didn't exist. A lot of people said that. So I found that whereas time expansion experiences are quite common, around 3/4 of people have had at least one time expansion experience in their lives. Time cessation experiences are much, much rarer. And they only occur in two different states. They occur in intense spiritual or mystical experiences, the kind of thing that Meister Eckhart was writing about or describing. They also occur in near-death experiences, either when a person comes very close to death, for example, if they fall off the side of a mountain and plunge towards apparent death, or if they physiologically do die for a short time before being resuscitated. So in those situations, people often speak about, on the one hand, they speak about a life review where they relive, not just remember, but actually relive every experience of their lives from birth to the present time. All of these experiences, this is what we call life flashing before your eyes. Every experience is relived from, childhood onwards. And it's not just a question of memory because people actually, they recall, they experience details that they weren't aware of at the time. They experience the events from multiple perspectives. They can perceive other people's reactions to those events when they were children that they weren't, aware of at the time. So the life review is not just memory; it is actually a re-experiencing of all the events of our lives. And sometimes people relive a selection of events rather than the whole thing, rather than all events, but often it is all the events of a person's life. So, in some ways, the life review is the most dramatic form of time expansion of all. Because how is it possible to relive a whole lifetime in a few seconds while you're falling off the side of a mountain or before you're resuscitated when you have after a near-death experience? So I think the only way to explain the life review is to suggest that all of those events of our lives, in some way, are actually still extant. We normally think of the past as having completely disappeared apart from in our memory. But the life review suggests that, in some sense, which is very difficult for us to comprehend, all of the events of our past are still there. They're still in existence. And also, there are many near-death experiences where people believe that they glimpse the future. They sometimes they feel that they're given a choice about whether to return to their bodies or not. They're in a place of peace. They feel completely comfortable where they are. But they're told that, if you want to return to your body, you are able to do that if you so desire. And they're often told that if they return to their body, these are the events that will unfold. They're shown a kind of pattern of their future events. And if they do return to their body, people often, when they begin to live through their future, they recognize the events that they were shown in near-death experiences. So, I believe that precognition is a real phenomenon. There are so many laboratory experiments over decades that have shown a significant success rate in precognition. There are so many well-attested examples of individuals who appear to have had the ability to glimpse the future. So precognition and the life review, they suggest that, the future, in some sense, the future already exists and the past still exists, which in turn suggests that linear time is illusory. We're really dealing with a kind of spatial time, a panorama where the past and the future exist alongside the present. That's
This
all
is
very mind-blowing.
I was just about to say that, yeah. And the people you spoke with about the life reviews, did regret ever come up? Was regret a theme there at all?
Sometimes, yeah, but a lot of people described how they were aware of a moral dimension to the life review. That they were very aware of, when they'd wronged people in the past, even if it was relatively minor, they were aware of the hurt that they'd caused to another person, and they felt bad about it. There was some degree of conscience and guilt about it, and that was why, after a life review, when people return to their ordinary lives, they do feel an enhanced sense of morality. They often become more altruistic and more aware of other people's feelings because they become really aware of how important it is to behave in an altruistic and a benevolent way.
That's interesting. This idea that at that point in life, when you're about to, you're going, that you might feel the suffering that you've caused in others. And even someone that gets through a whole lifetime
Mm,
without any empathy, without any compassion, they're eventually going to have to pay for that. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's just interesting to think about.
yeah.
With regards to precognition, can you tell us about David Mandel? I think this is incredible.
Mm. He was probably one of the most significant examples of precognition. And he was actually an art lecturer at a college. And this was in the 1990s. He began to have a series of intense dreams in which he had the inkling that he was glimpsing future events, future world events. And as an artist, he was able to draw his visions in very, very accurate detail. And he also wrote down certain details that he'd gleaned from the visions, specific details about where it was and, what happened. And because he was aware that people wouldn't believe him if these events did come to pass, he was aware that people wouldn't believe him. So he took the paintings to his local bank and photographed them under the clock. This was before the age of the internet, so in future times he could have sent an email to himself with which was dated and timed. But he took them to the local bank and had them photographed, and it turned out that many of his paintings were accurate. He had a vision of the Twin Towers, a plane flying into the Twin Towers. He actually drew it in his vision. Funnily enough, he had the vision on September the 11th, I think 5 years before the actual incident. And he wrote down, he also painted the Statue of Liberty to show that it was in New York. He also had a vision of the attack in a Tokyo subway, the poison gas attack in a Tokyo subway. And again, he mentioned that it was from a member of a cult. It was organized by a cult. He also predicted the Concorde crash in 1999, I think it was, in Paris. Again, he wrote that he showed Concorde crashing and wrote that it was in Paris. And he had a whole series of these visions, which he dated and painted in very specific detail. And his claims were investigated by parapsychologists, by Chris French, who was a skeptical, maybe you've heard of him, he's a very skeptical parapsychologist who's still active these days. But he concluded that it was, the most sort of thought-provoking and significant case of precognition he'd come across. And he couldn't explain it away. He was given David Mundell was given a lie detector test, and his paintings were given to independent observers who all rated that they were incredibly accurate and could not be explained away. So, I mean, just one case like that, to me, it proves that precognition is possible and real.
Yeah, I looked it up after learning about this, and it was September 11th, 1996, where he had
Oh, right.
and that's when he did the drawing. So you're right, 5 years before exactly. And then I also was just remembered, like, in Carl Jung's book, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he talks about having these visions before World War One of like a boot stepping on a European city and a sea of blood sweeping across Europe all the way to the Alps. So this was happening to him back then as
Mm.
well. If this is real, Steve, precognition, if this is a thing, like this has implications for free will, because this suggests that this is all determined. And like, what are your thoughts on that?
It's a very important point because it does superficially at least seem to suggest that we have no free will because the future seems to be determined. If what I say is true and the future already exists, then we're kind of inexorably pulled towards the future events that are already in place. But I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I think there is some room for free will. And there's a couple of pieces of evidence for this. One is, um, let me just give an example. In the book, I refer to the case of a young boy who, I think he was 8 years old, and he had a dream of himself riding his bike into a tree, crashing into a tree. And a couple of days later, he was riding his bike on the field, and he saw the tree, and he thought, "Oh, this is my dream. I'd better steer away from the tree." So he did that, and he avoided the accident. So in that case, his precognitive dream was obviously not completely accurate because he avoided the accident. And there are many precognitive dreams like that. They seem to serve as warnings of what could happen. And then people recognize the scene from their dreams and they take avoidant acts. They avoid the danger. So that suggests that there is some room for free will. And also, I referred to earlier about near-death experiences when people feel that they have a choice about whether to return to their bodies. And they are shown some patterns of future events that will unfold if they return. But obviously, they can choose not to return. So if they chose not to return, then their future events would not come to pass. So again, that suggests that the future is not completely fixed. So I think we're dealing with probability and potentiality rather than a future which is completely fixed. And so, yeah, I guess this fits with some theories from quantum physics, which are all about potentiality and probability rather than a fixed reality.
Are you aware of Anita Morjani, who had a
Hmm.
near-death experience. I spoke with her
Yeah.
a few months ago, and she was saying that whenever she was having hers, she said it was like perfect bliss, and she didn't want to come back. Like she's like,
Mm.
why would I, you know? But then she got like a message that was basically like, you've you've a purpose you've got to come back for, and it's linked with your husband's purpose as well, you know? And like I don't know, you can't verify these things. You have to just sort of take Anita's word. But what are your thoughts on like I suppose like this points to a bigger reality outside of life, and like what are your thoughts on these bigger picture questions like after death and stuff? Like what do you think? I know this is a massive question, but
Yeah.
um
Well, I don't really want to believe in life after death. I'm quite happy with the idea that this is all there is. I like the idea that there is a full stop to life. I think for me, the idea of an afterlife, it's like sort of getting to the end of a journey. You've reached the end of a long journey, and somebody says, "Hold on, there's another journey. You've got to carry on." I'm like, "No, I don't want to carry on. I'm tired. I want to stop here." So I don't really like the idea of life after death. I can kind of sort of countenance the idea that there is some sort of ocean of consciousness, and at the end of my individual life, my individual consciousness merges into this ocean like a wave dissolving into the ocean. I like that idea. But, on the basis of evidence as a scientist, I feel that I have to be open. I think that there does seem to be a strong possibility of some form of individual survival after death. So yeah, against my, desires, I feel that I'm obliged to, think to accept that is probably what's going to happen. I think that it's likely that my individual identity will survive in some form, at least for a certain amount of time.
hmm,
And that comes from not just near-death experiences, it comes from cases of reincarnation. You probably heard about the cases of reincarnation where children report details from their previous lives in a lot of detail. And, there's been a lot of investigation. Scientists have examined these reports and concluded that in some cases, they are impossible to explain away. It also comes from some mediums. There have been some really, really interesting cases of mediumship where people appear to glean incredibly accurate details without any possibility of obtaining the details from other ways. So yeah, there's a whole range of things that make me open to the idea that there is individual survival.
interesting. So a lot of your book, Steve, or what this seems to be all be pointing towards is the idea that time is actually special, you know, but we're so used to thinking of time in a linear way. So this is very difficult, at least for me, to sort of wrap my head around. So like, can you maybe help me to sort of conceptualize and understand time in a special way? Like, how can I start feeling that that is actually the case? And could you maybe sort of point me in the right direction here, if that makes sense?
I would say that, you know, have you ever had a time expansion experience yourself of the kind I describe in the book?
Nothing that dramatic. There's been times where I've had like maybe an accident or a fall, and it's felt like it's slowed down where I've noticed
Mm,
it, but nothing like what you're talking about, you know?
mm. I would say that these time expansion experiences, they are the beginning of time opening out into space. I think in a very clear and overt way, time expands to the point where it becomes spatial. It just opens up like a landscape, and the further the landscape opens up, the more space there is until there is only space. But I would say that maybe the best way to conceive of it is in terms of presence. There's I guess one way of looking at time, maybe a slightly different way of looking at time, is to think that in essence there is only the present, because on an everyday level, the future is all about planning and anticipating what may happen. It really only exists in our thoughts. And similarly, the past really only exists in our memory. All that we have is our experience of now, our surroundings, our experiences within our surroundings, what's happening within our own bodies, our own bodily sensations, any sensations or perceptions, any thoughts that are passing through our consciousness. That's all we can ever know. I think if you become really grounded in the present, and I guess meditation or mindfulness is a good way of doing that. It just means that your entire awareness is filled with your experience in the now without any thought or any kind of distraction or diversion. Your awareness is just purely open to the now. Then I think you do gain a sense that time is like space. This kind of the nowness of time becomes kind of spatial. It just kind of opens up around us. It's a bit like, normally we feel like we're walking down a long straight road into the future, away from the past into the future. It's kind of cutting through the landscape, walking in a straight line. But when we get into this state of presence, it's as if we step off the road. Well, it's as if the road just ceases to be there. The road just dissolves away. And we're in this landscape. It's like a panoramic natural landscape stretching all around us. So, it just opens up. The now becomes spatial. And yeah, I guess that's one way of conceiving of it.
The image that comes to mind for me is a metaphor I heard Alan Watts use years ago, and it was like everybody has this sensation that they're being driven by their past. The past is driving them, and that's determining everything in their present. And he said that it's much more accurate to think of yourself as like a boat in the sea, and everybody has the sensation that the wake of the boat or the wake of the ship is driving them, when in reality, the person that's driving that boat can change it at any point.
Yeah.
That's the present way to think about it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about it. Yeah. I often say to people when I do workshops, I sometimes do workshops on presence. And I often say to people that I give them I kind of guide them into a state of presence through meditation. And I say to them, where is the past now? Where is the future now? And they have a sense that, the past doesn't exist anymore. The future doesn't exist because it hasn't yet arrived. I also say to them, where are your achievements? Where are your failures? They're just nowhere. They don't exist in this present. You could even say, where are your possessions? Maybe there are some things in your room, but a lot of possessions are not here. They don't. It's only a kind of abstract idea that you possess these things. So in reality, all you have is your experience in the now. So I say to them, it's like an amnesty. The present is an amnesty. You become free of the past. Whatever has happened, whatever you have done in the past, you're free of it. You can just let go of it because it doesn't exist anymore. And that's quite liberating.
Yeah, well, it's like it's the creative point. Like the quality of the future you're going to experience is directly dependent on the quality of your actions now. And it also changes how you relate and feel about the past as well. Like if you're in a good state and you're thinking about the past from that state, then the past is totally changed too. So this is the moment from which everything else flows.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you're free to begin again in every moment. And obviously, maybe there are certain tendencies that you've inherited from your past experience. But, I think you can become free of them. You can begin literally with a blank state, a blank slate in the present moment. And it's interesting what you were saying about kind of recreating or changing the past. That's an interesting idea. And there's actually, I'm a bit reluctant to go into quantum physics because it's so kind of woolly and a lot of people use quantum physics you can use it to justify anything. But I take it quite seriously. I've read a lot of scientific papers about quantum physics, and one of the most interesting ideas of quantum physics is retrocausation, which is when waves from the present or from the future travel backwards. So waves from the future can travel back to the present. Waves from the present can travel back to the past. And you can actually at that in that kind of quantum at that quantum microscopic level, you can actually change the past. You can go back and cancel potentialities or probabilities from past experiences, from past events. So yeah, at that quantum level, the kind of division between past, present, and future seems to fade away.
Hmm. You hear you hear sometimes of people like they're about to make a decision or they're about to do something and they get a really strong sensation that not to do it or to take a different course or whatever. And it's something like what you're talking about here sort of points towards that reality. There's been times in my life where I've been about to do something and I get a really strong like signal just saying, don't fucking do that. Do not do that,
Mm,
or change or whatever. And it's so strong that I have to go and change, like do the thing, So
mm.
I think there's something to that. It's hard. It's almost impossible to explain, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that stems from the fact that, in some sense, the future is already there, and you know what's going to happen because it's already there. I think there's something similar when people speak about a sense of destiny or fate. I think that stems from the fact that, in some sense, it's already happened. You are moving towards a future which is already set. Um, so yeah, again, it points to this the kind of spatialness of time, the spatiality of time.
Here's a wacky idea, just thinking out loud here. But what if it's sort of set up like a game where there's like all of these potential different paths for your life, and there's like, and again, just total speculation, but what if one of these paths is like the path that's like your optimal, best, the life that you're supposed to live,
Mm,
and there are all these alternatives, and maybe you keep coming back and keep coming back, keep coming back until you take the best path and you become that sort of the best version of you. And then that's when the full stop hits. And then you can sort of, I know, I totally
mm.
just thinking out loud, but interesting to think
You
about.
mean you keep coming back as in you're reborn or reincarnated?
Yeah, you hit reset on Steve Taylor and
Mm,
you come back born again. And then you play the game again until you make all the right choices and
yeah.
you become the best Steve Taylor that could have been,
Yeah. It reminds me of there's a song by Van Morrison, and Van Morrison was really into spirituality, especially in the 1980s. He did a whole series of spiritual albums, and he's got this song where he sings, "If you get it right this time, you don't ever have to come back again." So, something like that.
That's sort of I'm getting at, but again, it's wild speculation.
Yeah, there's the general idea of Buddhism is similar to that you keep being reincarnated until you become enlightened, and then you can step off the wheel of rebirth and ascend to nirvana.
So in the book, Steve, you talk about the link between like high performance sports people and time and how they seem to have the capacity and ability to slow down time. Can you maybe tell us about your thoughts on this?
After accidents and emergencies, sport is you know the other main area where time expansion experiences occur. So there are many cases of well-known athletes and sports people speaking about time expansion, baseball players, basketball players, soccer players, tennis players, and so forth. But also from amateur sports people, I've collected a lot of examples from people playing sport for pleasure. Occasionally, they entered this different state of consciousness where time just slowed down, and they had a lot of extra time. It seemed like they had a lot of extra time to position themselves, to avoid their opponents, to plan what they were going to do. So obviously, in sport, time expansion is a massive advantage, and that's why when people told me these stories, it was always when they did something amazing, when they were at the peak of their abilities, and they as a result they won the game. Um, and I guess there are certain sports where it seems to be more important. For example, there are many reports of time expansion from motor racing, particularly Formula One. There's even there was a Formula One driver called Jackie Stewart. I think he was mainly active in the 1970s, I think. But he said that unless you can slow down time, you can't be a Formula One driver because it would be impossible. You can't go around the bend at 200 miles an hour without slowing down time. Otherwise, you'd crash. And if you want to be a good Formula One driver, it's imperative to have time to be able to slow down time. So yeah, there are many quotes from Formula One drivers, and often they also report feeling strangely detached from themselves, as if they're overlooking the situation. They have this kind of overview, which is again is really helpful because they feel as though they can see in front of them or behind them. This kind of, you know, 2020 vision. And so what I speculate is that the very best sports people, the most elite of all the elite athletes, that they not only have the ability to experience time expansion, but time expansion is their normal state. It's very easy for them to slip into a state of consciousness where time expands. So somebody like Lionel Messi, for example, there've actually been several papers about him suggesting that he somehow neurologically time moves slower for him. And you can see this if you watch him. He's so kind of graceful. He seems to be moving so slowly. And I think George Best, he was similar. Maybe Maradona. So all these great footballers, I think what really separates them from others is not just their skill, not just their fitness, not just their awareness or whatever. It's the ability to slow down time.
Yeah, yeah. There was a book I read a few years ago by a guy called Josh Waitzkin. It's called The Art of Learning. And he he is a world chess champion, Tai Chi push hands world champion, and has like the highest level black belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu as well. So he's like he knows how to learn and how to sort of get to the top of the field in different areas. And his theory on this is that it's about information processing. So essentially, the conscious mind can only handle what is it like 7 bits of information per unit of time or whatever. And his theory is that the best in the world, say your Messi's or whatever, or the George Best, or they have so made every one of those situations like habitual, so that it's for them, because it's so ingrained in their nervous system, that frees their conscious mind to really focus on the present moment and to see
Mm,
minutia detail that wouldn't be um that isn't accessible to the novice. So for example, if I'm learning to drive, so much of my conscious attention is like on like changing gears and like putting the clutch in
mm,
like it's so much the thing. So I can't speak to anybody. I can't look out the windows. Whereas after a few years of driving, that's all part of my habitual nervous system. So that frees my conscious attention to look elsewhere and
mm.
really be present, you know? So
Yeah.
do you think that adds up at all with what you're looking at?
That's interesting. Although he wouldn't explain why it's so rare for athletes or sports people to experience time expansion. Because you'd assume that many of them reach that state where they're consciously aware of what they're doing. But I mean, it's true that there is a strong connection between information processing and time perception. That's why new experiences and new environments make time pass slowly because we're processing a lot more information. So it's true in that sense. So I think that may be a factor, but I think there's something more. I think again, it's about an altered state of consciousness in which boundaries fade away. I think it's interesting that many of the athletes who do experience time expansion, they're kind of slightly unusual people. They're a bit neurodiverse. I think Messi's like that. Probably Maradona, George Best were a bit like that. Not completely normal people. I think that kind of slight, neurodivergence helps them to cultivate or to enter an altered state of consciousness in which time expands.
Yeah. And this links a little bit with something else I wanted to ask you. Why why do we all have a sensation? Like it's definitely been the case for me. Like time is going at a rapid rate. I can't believe it's 2025. Why does time seem to speed up the older we get? What's going on?
Again, it's about information processing. I mean, there are a few different theories. Usually, the theory, whenever I do talks about time, somebody always puts a hand up and says, "I've got my theory. I've got a theory. It's about proportion. When you're 4 years old, 1 year is a quarter of your whole life, so it seems massive. But when you're 50, 1 year is just like 2% of your whole life, so it seems insignificant. So that's possibly something to do with it. But the problem with that theory is that we don't live our lives like that. We don't live each day in relation to our lives as a whole. We live each day at a time. We live in the present without, without much reference to the past usually. But I think the best theory for me is information processing. And that's because when you're a child, everything is new. You're experiencing everything for the first time. You're living in this strange, miraculous world of unfamiliarity and wonder. But as you get older, there are very few new experiences in your life. Your life tends to become more full of routine and repetition. You live in a familiar environment, often repeating the same experiences again and again. And also, I think there is a psychological mechanism that switches our attention off to new experiences. It's like when you go into, in the old days, you used to walk into a pub that was full of smoke and you think, wow, I can't stand it. It's terrible in here. I've got to go out. But within 5 minutes, you just don't sense it anymore. You kind of switch off to it. Or you move to a new place and it's all really exciting and fresh. But, within a few weeks, you've adjusted to it. It's kind of normal and slightly mundane. So there's a kind of mechanism in our minds that switches off our attention to unfamiliarity. So by the time we're older, we're living in this world of familiarity. It's all quite mundane. And every year there is progressively less new experience in our lives. And, as a result, time seems to go gradually faster.
So then the solution to that is then we need to increase the flow of these new experiences.
That's one solution. Yeah. I have this idea that I talk about in the book of two twins. And there's one twin who leaves school at the age of 16 and she gets a job in her hometown. She spends 40 years working with the same company. She spends her whole life in the same town, maybe goes on holiday for 2 weeks of the year, but everything else is just kind of routine and repetition. But the other twin, she decides to go traveling around the world when she finishes school. She lives in Australia, travels through Asia. She has all kinds of adventures in different countries around the world for decade after decade. But assuming those two twins die on the same day, the second twin will actually have lived a much longer life than the first one. She will actually have lived through much, much more time than the other person. And that's not just, that's not an illusion. It's actually it's actually a fact that she experiences more time because of all the unfamiliarity in her life. So we can do that. We can make sure that we're exposed to newness, that we don't live according to routine and repetition. But maybe even more fundamentally, we can change the way we perceive the world. You don't have to travel to a different country to slow down time. You can slow down time by being consciously aware of your familiar environment, by not switching off to familiarity, by being mindful. And there's actually research suggesting that people who have practiced meditation for a long time, they actually have a slower passage of time than others. Presumably that's because they are more consciously aware of their surroundings. So in essence, there was always a new experience flowing into their consciousness simply because they are more open to their experience.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. There is another factor actually, which is that, since fundamentally our normal sense of time is created by our ego boundaries, if we soften our ego boundaries and make them more kind of fluid, and if we become more connected to our surroundings, that also helps to slow down time.
It's an interesting study that could potentially be done, like a twin study where you look at openness to experience and you look at perception of time. I don't know if there's a scale for that or not, but it would be interesting just to look at the data there,
Yeah, yeah. I did a study. This is it's totally different, but there's a degree of similarity. I went to the airport here in Manchester, where I live, and I asked returning holiday makers, what kind of holiday they'd been on and whether they felt that it had gone quickly or slowly. And people who'd been through more kind of package type holidays when they'd just been in a resort for 2 weeks, they usually said something like, "Oh, the first few days went slow, but after that it just sped by. It went by in a flash." But people who've been for more adventurous type holidays, maybe they've been sort of trekking around Asia, or they've been, even if it's just like a work trip to America for a few days, they often said that time had gone very slowly. So there was definitely a connection between the degree of unfamiliarity in a person's holiday and how they experience time.
So it seems that the more you live your life on automatic mode or autopilot, the quicker time is going to seem like it's passing. Whereas the more you are consciously engaged with new experiences, novelty, these things, like it's going to seem richer and more, it's passing slower and more meaningfully, probably as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good summary. There are so many advantages to being consciously aware and living a richer, more fulfilling life. It brings you enhanced well-being, for one thing, but also it expands time. So it's you know, that's another of the benefits.
For sure. For sure. Well, for example, like me sitting, I don't know, just spending a normal hour like walking, or that's not a bad thing to do, but just say watching some crap on TV or whatever. That time is going to seem much less significant in my memory than having this 1 hour conversation with you, because there's so much being covered here that is like just, it's interesting, and it's just an example of what we're getting at, I
Mm.
suppose.
Yeah, it's tricky because TV is a good example because sometimes people say to me, how can I slow down time? Like if I've got a day off work or a weekend, how can I make it last for as long as possible? And probably the worst thing you can do is sit in front of your TV and watch a series on Netflix because it will just make the whole afternoon will just disappear in a flash. The best thing you can do is, travel to a new place, go into the countryside, be consciously aware of your surroundings. I've had that experience. I've started to go to the Lake District quite a lot, which is not too far away from where I live, just to walk for the day or climb a mountain. And often when I come home, I feel like I've been away for ages. It feels like not just a day, it feels more like a week. And it's just because of all the rich experience, all the different landscapes, all the different, perceptions, different sensations. It's really stretches time. So, and at the same time as having the kind of the therapeutic, contact with nature is always very, very therapeutic. I always feel a sense of that kind of glow of well-being. Yeah, I have this feeling that I've expanded time as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's been my experience too. And what do you think, like the standard relationship to that people have with time is in our culture? Like for me, it can be an oppressive thing a lot of time. You can sort of like I live in Dublin, and sometimes you sort of feel like everybody around you is in a rush, or
Mm,
like particularly in places like London, I get the sense that if everybody else around me is rushing, I feel like I need a rush
yeah.
too. Whereas if I'm in the countryside, like I can just go at my own pace. So what do you think the standard relationship with time is? And the second part of this question is, if someone does feel oppressed by time and they feel like they're always rushing, have you any words of wisdom for them that they can maybe have a friendly relationship with time?
Hmm. Most people do have an unhealthy relationship to time. And partly it's because we're always aware of time. You know, we can never forget. It's quite rare that we can forget about time, especially these days when we spend a lot of time in front of screens and the time is always in front of us. And, we're very aware of the future. We live our lives, in terms of the future. And the future always creates pressure. The future is full of deadlines, it's full of appointments. So it always creates pressure. And yeah, I think a lot of people feel that time is running away, that they don't have enough of it. They feel that time is their enemy. And as you say that, I think a lot of psychological maladies come from that, the kind of stress that time pressure creates. So I think the remedy for those maladies is essentially to become present. If you become entirely present, time no longer exists for you. I often feel like that myself. My life is quite busy. I do have a lot of deadlines and appointments in the future. And sometimes, if I'm not kind of in tune with myself, I can feel the stress of that and think, oh no, I've got to do this. And how am I going to fit it all in? But then I settle down to meditate or I go walking in the countryside and it all just fades away. It just becomes, okay, I'll deal with it when it comes. So the future becomes like I always think of it, it's like you can encounter it as you go. You don't need to anticipate it. You don't need to worry about it. You can just encounter it as you move towards it. You don't have to jump ahead of yourself. You can just live in a relaxed way in the present, meeting your appointments and deadlines as they arise. So presence is definitely the remedy. As your mind becomes still, as you attune to the present, the future ceases to exist.
Beautiful, beautiful. Something I've found quite helpful as well, is see at night, if it's a clear sky, like for some reason, if I sit and look at the stars for long enough, doesn't have to be that long, it just puts everything in context. And I see that these
Yeah,
problems that I think are the end of the world, they're really, they're not that big a deal. And that sort of,
yeah,
this contemplation of the space around us seems to create inner space as well, you know?
yeah, that's right. I feel the same when I'm amongst mountains. I sometimes say to myself, these mountains have been here for millions of years. And to these mountains, my life is nothing. Even the whole existence of the human race means nothing. The whole of evolution means nothing to these mountains. So we'll pass away, I will pass away, maybe even our species will pass away, and the mountains will just remain completely indifferent to us. And it does put things in perspective.
For sure. Like, thinking about the mountain, it sort of like helps you to sort of get in that state where it's like you're almost like more of a witnessing presence, than you're less caught up in the fluctuating ups and downs of life, you know? Is
Yeah.
is there is there anything from the book? You're doing a lot of interviews for this now, Steve. Is there anything from the book that you feel is really important, but you're not getting asked about in the book, that you're not maybe getting to share, that you'd like to share?
Um, well, one thing which people often don't ask me about, but which I think is important, is the after effects of these experiences. Um, you know, Besides the kind of the temporal aspects, one of the most salient aspects of the experiences is the sense of calm well-being which people experience. So even if a person is close to death, even if they're falling off the side of a mountain, even if their car is spinning around on the motorway, they don't feel frightened, they don't feel traumatized, they feel this marvelous sense of calm well-being. And also, they learn that they are resilient and competent enough to deal with the situation. I mean, I never thought that I would be so calm in a life-threatening situation. I kind of secretly suspected that I would fall to pieces in life-threatening situations. So it was amazing to me that I felt this confidence and this competence and resilience. And a lot of people remark on that. They said that, I was amazed that I was so calm and collected, and I was amazed at the preventative action I was able to enact. So it changes people's opinions about themselves. They realize that they are stronger, more resilient than they expected. And maybe even more importantly, they realize that when the next time they face death or intense danger, they will be able to cope with it. They will be able to deal with the situation. And maybe they will be able to transcend the danger. But even, people skirt the edges of death. They even do die for a certain amount of time. But in a paradoxical way, they find well-being in that experience. So they lose their fear of death as well. And they believe that death is no longer something to be afraid of. So these experiences they are transformative in that sense.
Amazing, amazing. Well, this is a great note to end on. Where can people get the book? Where can they find you online? You've got a newsletter as well, Steve. Where would you point people to sign up for that?
The best place is my website, which is stephenmtaylor.com. That's Stephen with a V, M for Mark, stephenmtaylor.com. So people can sign up for my monthly newsletter and also find out about my social media accounts and my activities and my other books and writings.
Fantastic. And is there a seed of a next book growing in you at the moment, or it's what's the situation?
Well, I've just finished a book of poetry. I'm a kind of I have a sideline as a poet. I've published 3 volumes of poetry, and because I've been spending a lot of time in nature, I've been writing a lot of nature poetry and a spiritual, natural poetry. So I've just put together a book of nature poetry, which I'm gonna hopefully publish the end of this year or maybe next year.
Fantastic, fantastic. Right. Well, Steve, I want to wish you the best of luck with the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to see where what comes next. So take care, and we'll
Yeah,
talk soon.
brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Niall. Thank you.